Really, and I think this axiom holds up. The one common denominator that holds it all together is that it's intentionally not Christian. At the same time, though, it's not even that easy because one of the ways I wanted to look at this topic was through the unexpected instances of cross-pollination, where the Jews were influencing Christians and vice versa. I do think that there is a tendency to downplay some of the roles original Christian thinkers had in influencing others, be they Jew or otherwise. There's a tendency, especially among polemicists, to focus exclusively or near exclusive on the role of the Jews. The idea that the Jews are this ever looming presence waiting or actively subverting a passive, receptive Christian society, when really you find just as often Christians influencing Jews as you find Jews influencing Christians. And maybe, I mean, one of the most consequential thinkers of the Middle Ages is this man on the left, Joachim of Fiore, a 12th century Italian abbot and theologian. While his influence has been in and out of fashion among various groups, there can be no doubt, in my opinion, that his idea of history unfolding in stages would have repercussions down to our very day. It's a revolutionary departure from the traditional Augustinian view of a singular trajectory of history towards the eschaton. Joachim's position was that history was much more dynamic, that it was changing and evolving and unfolding, and subsequently this would have a long-standing influence on both Jewish and Christian thought. The Jewish mind, ever eager to find signs of the Messiah in history or in present reality or in the future expectations, found this historiographic understanding particularly appealing. Another interesting crossover is the situation of Jews in the Cathars. And I found this one in particular a good illustration of how convoluted all of this can get. So the Cathars were a dualist religious sect from southern province of France, in particular Languedoc. Now, for various reasons, southern France at this time was a fairly liberal, in the true sense of the word, liberal place. Differing ideas, religious or social, freely intermingled. The Jews of this region, ancestors largely of the Sephardic Jews of Spain, in particular benefited from this type of environment. The Cathars, for their part, taught of the wickedness and corruption of the Catholic Church and its clergy. Its members, especially the perfecti, as they were called, lived lives of model virtue in many ways. They eschewed opulence and wealth for poverty and had a distrust of the flesh, a distrust of all created things, in fact. At least that was the ideal, anyway. Now, this isn't to say that there were obvious, blatant crossovers in the ideas of Jews and Cathars. In fact, sometimes the influence was a reaction or rejection of certain ideas. So it takes a bit of historical reconstruction to find all of the commonalities and divergences. A few good books which discuss this are The Origins of Kabbalah by Shalem and The Jewish Influence on Christian Reform Movements by Louis Newman. Both good resources, especially the latter one. Now, one thing that they did have in common was a general distrust and dislike of Catholics. While the Jews, as we'll discuss in a future lecture, had a particular affinity for the papacy, they held no such affinity for the average layman or clergy. The reason the Cathars were so successful was due in part to the fact that in the region of Albi, the princes had become patrons of this sect, hence the title Albigensian for the heresy, but these same princes also patronized the Jews. A monk in Spain wrote of this marriage of interest, quote, "Likewise many heretics with certain deliberate malice become circumcised, and under the guise of Jews, as if for the sake of disputing, come to Christians and ask heretical questions. Thus the Jews sow heresies more freely, though at first they did not dare to speak the word of heresy. The secular heads and judges of the cities hear the doctrines of heresy from Jews, whom they number among their familiars and friends. If anyone led by zeal for the law of God exacerbates any of them, he is punished as if he touched the pupil of his eye of the judge of the city. They teach other Jews to propose their blasphemies against Christians, in order that they can thus pervert the Catholic faith. All the synagogues of the malignant Jews have patrons, and they placate the leaders with innumerable gifts and seduce by gold the judges of their own culture. I bring this quote up because it illustrates the general Christian belief that this overseer work of the princes who, quote, simulate the perfidy of the Jews was believed to have a Judaizing effect on the population of Albi. So the question is like, do you see the conflict here? Related to this, to help us further set the stage, I thought it worthwhile to highlight again that at this period of seeming homogeneity of religious culture in Europe, there's also a revival of sorts of an ancient heretical movement. There's variations of these ancient dualist heresies migrating during the opening of the trade routes. And interestingly, this dualism, which never really had roots in the West until this period, begins to find its way here. We can trace it down through the Christian centuries, from antiquity into the Middle Ages, from early Eastern Gnosticism to Marcionism to Manichaeism to the Paulician heresy to the Bogomils, all the way down to the Cathars. And it's not until that we get to the Cathars that we see this dualist heresy become really planted in the West. But it is at this cultural crossroads that we see the effects of Jewish and European intermingling at these fragile early moments of Jewish introduction into these parts of Europe. And this collision will have severe ramifications very shortly. As we said in the last lecture, these ideas are passing back and forth, one influencing the other. Sometimes it's an influence that's an embrace of ideas. Other times it's a aversion or a reaction from one group to the other, because this isn't to say that the Jews and the Cathars agreed with each other on everything. In fact, sometimes their influence on one another was reactionary. It said, quote, the Albigenses in southern France, who were branded as heretics and who were the most resolute opponents of the papacy, had imbibed their hostility from intercourse with educated Jews. That's from Greitz's History of the Jews. So even though their ideas, their particular religious manifestations may not have aligned one to one, that's a very common theme, right? A certain hostility towards the church, towards this new emerging papacy. And if you think about it, just as one example, the very same mobs who the Jews are sometimes influencing or inciting are the same mobs who will just as easily turn against them, that is the Jews, as they would against the church. And there's more than a few examples in all of this of Jews sowing the wind and reaping the whirlwind. But it is going to be helpful as we discuss these complex relations to the church and the Jews to be able to, as much as we possibly can, distinguish between who is who. And when you are studying this, I would really recommend taking the time to begin by seeing who all these players involved are. And don't assume that just because it's a non-Jewish actor, that it is automatically working in the interest or behalf of Holy Mother Church. Sometimes it could be quite the opposite. And what you'll come to discover is it's not always as easy as we'd like it to be. This idea of trying to figure out who's on whose side, who represents who, really is a challenging thing. And it's offered me a lot of interesting challenges as I tried to pull together these lectures to present to you guys something concise, yet also somewhat comprehensive. So, in that vein, I want to go even a little bit further into this idea of competing churches because, and I'm saying churches here in quotes, this idea of competing churches because it is very easy to get the wrong impression of this period of the Middle Ages. Yes, it is a time when the papacy exerted enormous control over the church. Orthodoxy was heavily enforced, but it was also still widely challenged. Even during the apex of Christendom, orthodoxy had its challenges. And to get a sense of this, I want to highlight two men, Peter Waldo and St. Francis of Assisi. So at this period in the church, there is, in the time leading up to Waldo and Francis, what I would call a spirit of reform that had taken hold in Europe. Many of these reform movements that sprang out of this spirit were later deemed heretical. We've discussed the Cathars, but there was also the Humiliati, the Petrobrusians, the Insabati, and the Waldensians, as they would come to be known. These groups in particular come from largely come from a biblicist movement of the day that had a particularly anti-clerical and anti-sacramental streak to them. One man in particular was Peter Waldo. He's a wealthy merchant from Leon. This should ring a bell from our discussions on the dualists last time, Leon being the hotbed of all of those heresies. At some point, Peter Waldo has a deep conversion. He gives away all of his possessions and decides to live out an austere life of preaching and penance. One of the features of these biblicist movements was a desire for the Bible in the vernacular. Waldo, coming from this faction, subsidized a house of monks who translated the Latin Vulgate into the vulgar tongue for him, and he then set out preaching and teaching using what appears to be the New Testament, the Psalms, and maybe a few books of the Old Testament like Job. And the particular targets of his preaching were the Eucharist, which he saw as merely symbolic, and against the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church. His followers, the Waldensians, would take these teachings even further, and we'll discuss in the next lecture some of the interesting overlap between them and the local Jewish community. But now you compare this to St. Francis of Assisi. Like Waldo, Francis comes from a wealthy merchant family. He undergoes a very powerful conversion. But unlike Waldo, Francis never abandons Holy Mother Church. In fact, he goes out of his way once he starts to gain followers to seek out formal recognition from the papacy, which is granted to him. And that's also not to say that Francis doesn't see the deep rot, spiritual and structural, that has consumed the church. He certainly did. His was a reforming movement in the vein of all these others taking place simultaneously. He's tasked by our Lord at San Damiano to rebuild my church. And in the next few years, it is his friars which would become the largest monastic order in all of Europe. I chose Francis here and not Dominic because the Franciscan order also represents better the unique challenges we'll be faced with as we try to navigate the relation between Jew and church. The Dominicans, it's always pretty straightforward. They're ordered after the Canons Regular, which was an already well-established rule. Everything was pretty regularized for them. And if you did have trouble with a Dominican, it was usually a lone wolf. The Franciscans, following Francis's rule from his own dictation, took on a more anarchic quality and fractured almost immediately. And within that fractured rule, we find various reforms within the reforms, some of which fall down that well into the pits of anti-clericalism, which plagued the other heretical reform movements. And then they're all blending and melding together. And really, again, I just can't stress it enough. It's almost impossible at times to tell who's who, who's representing what group. Sometimes, especially, for example, the Italians, they'll like to call somebody the Fraticelli, but the Fraticelli are several different groups, unrelated to one another, but all given the same name. And then, of course, in the midst of all of this volatile, changing atmosphere, we find the Jewish population. And as we're going to take the time to go through some of the major hubs of activity and see what's happening where, the first place we want to look at are with the Jews of Italy. That inaction leads to what I call a spirit of anti-clericalism. Now, we talked about this scattered throughout the last two lectures, this theme of reform and anti-clericalism rampant in the Middle Ages, and how it weaves into the Jewish dilemma for the church. And I want to kind of help start off this phase of our journey by noting where it is in this late period. A reminder, we're stopping in this lecture just shy of 1500, right as the Protestant Reformation gets underway, where that spirit of anti-clericalism finds a permanent relief valve, or maybe I should say an off-ramp from the church. At this time, though, it isn't always so clear who's in, who's out, who's speaking on behalf of the church. And as we said, there is even a point where the man who's supposed to be the Roman pontiff, well, you have three claimants to that chair. So which one do we listen to? And if you're sitting there in the Middle Ages during the schism, it's not so clear. We have even saints who believe that one of the anti-popes we know now is the anti-pope of those three rival claimants were actually incorrect and who they assessed to be the correct pope. There's also a spiritual lacuna following the Black Death when the monasteries they were so very disproportionately affected. By the 15th century, you really see this existential moment where everyone is aware that something needs to give in the monastic world. Some, like Thomas à Kempis, call for a monastic reform. By the time you get to Luther, of course, the objective becomes to completely dissolve the monasteries. But certainly, this anti clerical streak, which permeates medieval society, is going to be heavily influenced by and be influencing on the European Jews. And we have, for this lecture, two examples. We're going to look at the Waldensians and the Hussites. So while piecing together the connection between the Cathars and the Jews earlier, in one of the earlier lectures, was more of an investigative journey for historians, the link between these latter heretical groups and the Jews becomes much more pronounced. There are numerous examples that we could give, and this current actually runs right down into the Protestant Reformation, but there emerges in the late Middle Ages more and more this regression of Christian groups into an old law mentality, which inevitably led to the Judaizing features so many churchmen of the day preached against. Followers of the man we looked at last time, Peter Waldo, become known as the Waldensians or the Waldenses. The primary feature of the Waldensians was their rejection and open opposition to the ritual and sacerdotal system of the Catholic Church. They would call this form of what in their eyes was heresy Pharisaical. Now, this may be surprising to some of you since we are saying here that it was the Waldenses who were the ones accused of Judaizing, and yet it's them who are accusing the Catholic Church of being Pharisaical. But all of this is relative to the vantage point you were standing from. For the Waldenses, they look at the system of penance and priesthood and ritual, and they see something modeled after the scribes and Pharisees. Whereas it may be a little harder, it is, in my opinion, objectively truer that they and the other groups like them who habitually fall back into the true Judaizing tendencies. From Rhinarius to Capel, the accusation that the Waldenses were iconoclasts, for example, is a common one. Capel says, quote, they, that is the Waldenses, detest the images and crucifixes of the Catholics. Now, regardless of how they, or the later Protestants for that matter, view the Catholic Church, the objective reality is that their position on this is more in conformity with modern Judaic views of images, making them, in this sense, the true Judaizers. The Waldenses also refused to invoke the saints or to pray for souls in purgatory. Maybe the most damning of all, they identified themselves with the body of the ancient Israelites. And this is going to be a common theme, again, well down into the Protestant revolutions, including, for example, the radical Anabaptists and the Puritans, on up through to many of the fundamentalist groups of the 19th century and their various offshoots. You find it today, for example, with the um, much in the news at the moment of the recording of this, the Christian Zionists. They begin to call Peter Waldo their Moses, leading them out of captivity of the Egyptians and their Pharaoh. You could read that, the Catholic Church and the Pope. Now, as to whether all of this comes from direct access and contact with the Jews, I think there is once again a very strong case to be made for that. The Waldenses come from the region of Lyons, so crucial to all of these intermingling of ideas. We know that Sigebert of Glembour's worked in conjunction with the local Jews to get his translation of the Bible. We also know that once the Hussite movement broke out, the triangular relation between Waldenses, Jews, and Hussites becomes clearer. So many historians have traced this backward and seen the parallels there even before the circumstances in Bohemia became more favorable to these divergent groups. Which leads me to the next group, the Hussites, also known as the Taborites, also known as the Utraquists. The Hussites could easily take up a whole lecture unto themselves, and they, more than any of these groups, I think, meet the criteria of a truly and intentionally Judaizing sect in medieval Europe, where the Cathars and the Waldensian sects had largely been to the northwest of Rome in southern France. The Hussites came from the east, and they were not so easily rooted out as the previous heresies had been. Formed by Jan Hus, who was part of a religious reforming movement in Bohemia, which placed emphasis on biblical literacy, especially the Old Testament, especially in the original Hebrew. In order to familiarize himself with Hebrew, Hus had mastered the works of Jews such as Moses Maimonides. As he grew to fame and to the increasing ire of Catholic clergy, he began more and more to identify himself with Old Testament figures, such as the major and minor prophets. Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance and was burned at the stake. The most radical of his followers, known as the Taborites, for their reading of and self-identification with the book of Exodus, and as I was alluding to a moment ago, the Jews in proximity to the Hussites in the east felt it in their interest to ally with this movement, as they saw the benefits of coexistence with a Judaizing sect versus the restrictions of the Catholic Church as a given. The hostility between the Taborites and the Catholic Church would eventually break out into open war, and it is not without serious evidence that I think it's safe to say that the Jews of Bohemia largely backed the Taborites in this endeavor. We're going to come back to that in a bit. First, though, I want to discuss this tension between viewing the Jews of the Middle Ages as scapegoats versus viewing them as aggressors.